Hi everyone, today we're going to look at main and subordinate clauses. Before we get started, I just want you to have a little think about what you already know. What is a clause? What is a subordinate clause? And how might we use a subordinate clause? So phrases which contain a verb are called clauses. A clause always contains a subject performing a verb. But what does that mean? For example, Lily ran. Lily is the subject. She is the person who is doing the action. Ran is the verb. That is the action which is being completed. We have a subject, Lily, who is performing a verb, ran. So this is a clause. Let's have a look and see if we can identify some examples in the sentences below. What you need to do is read each of the examples and see if you can identify the verb and identify the subject performing that verb. Lola sang beautifully. Is that a phrase or a clause? The subject of the sentence, in this case, is Lola. The action that Lola is performing is sang. Lola sang. So number 1 is a clause. An abandoned ship. The verb in that sentence, we can't find one, therefore that is a phrase. The white flower. Identify the verb. We can't find one, therefore it is a phrase. The boys kicked the football. In that sentence we have the verb kicked and the subject, the boys, are doing the action. The boys kicked the football. Clause. Opposite the park. We look for a verb. There is no verb, therefore it is a phrase. And the wind howled fiercely. The subject is the wind. The verb is howled, therefore it is a clause. How many of those did you get right? So there are different types of clauses. We're going to start by looking at main clauses. So the main clause contains a subject performing a verb. Every sentence has at least one main clause. The main clause is the most important idea in the sentence. It expresses a complete thought, so it makes sense on its own. All of the ones on the previous slide were main clauses. Lola sang beautifully. The boys kicked the football. The wind howled fiercely. They all make sense on their own. They all give the most important information. Subordinate clauses. A subordinate clause gives extra information about the main clause. It can come before or after the main clause, but if you read it by itself, it doesn't make sense on its own. So here we have an example. The main clause contains the most important idea in the sentence. The subordinate clause is less important. It just gives the reader a bit more detail. Although she was clumsy, Harriet caught the netball. Have a look at that sentence. Where is the main clause? Harriet caught the netball. That is a full idea. It makes sense on its own. subordinate clause, although she was clumsy, is not a complete idea and does not make sense without being attached to the main clause. Let's look at some examples. Decide whether the underlined section is a main clause or a subordinate clause. Let's have a look at these together. Emery arrived after the school bell had rung. So the bit we are looking at is after the school bell had rung. Does that give us a full idea? Does it make sense on its own? No. Therefore, after the school bell had rung is a subordinate clause. Although I was terrified, I crept up the creaking staircase. Although I was terrified does not make sense on its own, therefore it is a subordinating clause. It was raining, so we cancelled our picnic. We cancelled our picnic. Yes, that makes sense on its own, therefore that is a main clause. Despite it being -2 degrees outside, Frank still didn't bring his jumper to school. Despite it being -2 degrees outside is a subordinating clause. On Fridays we normally go swimming, but today I forgot my kit. Today I forgot my kit is a main clause. The fox slinked through the dense undergrowth and pounced on the unsuspecting mouse. The fox slinked through the dense undergrowth makes sense on its own, therefore that is a main clause. So far we've looked at two types of clause, main clauses and subordinate clauses. It is important that you are able to distinguish between these. Remember that both of them contain a subject performing a verb, but only main clauses make sense on their own. If you're unsure, you can use the following questions to help you identify the different types of clauses. So, does it contain a subject performing a verb? Yes, then we know it's a clause. Does it make sense on its own? Yes, therefore it is a main clause. Does it make sense on its own? No, then we know that it is a subordinate clause. So sometimes clauses are linked together. Although you can construct a sentence from a single clause, complex sentences will contain more than one. To link clauses together, you need to use a special type of word class. Can you remember what do we call the words that link clauses together? Conjunctions. For example, James stepped on the ice and he slipped over. Can you identify the conjunction in this sentence? And links together the two ideas. James stepped on the ice, he slipped over. They are joined by and. They are both main clauses performing because they contain a subject performing a verb, and they both make sense on their own. Subordinating conjunctions. Now we have lots of ways we try and remember these. Conjunctions which link together a main and a subordinate clause are called subordinating conjunctions. There are many different ones, including although, as, because, before, despite, if, since, though, unless, whereas, while, so that. What other ones can you think of? It's important to remember that so that is a subordinating conjunction. However, so on its own is a coordinating conjunction, so you must not confuse the two. Now be careful with conjunctions. Although they link clauses together, they do not have to come between the two clauses. They aren't always in the middle of our sentences. Although she was clumsy, Harriet caught the netball. Harriet caught the netball, although she was clumsy. Here you can see that although is the conjunction. However, in our first example, it is at the beginning, and in our second example, it is in the middle. Here are 3 sentences. Can you identify the conjunctions in each of these sentences? Lexi played outside until it was time for dinner. Before Mum arrived home, Henry dared me to eat a slug. Oscar wasn't paying attention, so he walked into the lamppost. Have you found the conjunctions in each of these sentences? We have until, before, and so. Let's look at some of the examples that you will find in your workbook. Label each of the clauses in the sentence below as either the main clause or the subordinate clause. In your head, read each of the parts of the sentence. Remember, if it makes sense on its own, it is the main clause. If it does not make sense on its own, it is the subordinating clause. When the bell rang. That is an example of a subordinate clause. It doesn't make sense on its own, it is not a full idea. It also has the subordinating conjunction when. That gives us another clue. We dashed into the playground is a main clause. And we started a game of football is also a main clause. Both of those parts of the sentence make sense on their own. We do not know what she is playing, therefore it is a subordinate clause. Billy could not play tennis with her friend Lana because Lana did not have a racket. The underlined part is Billy could not play tennis with her friend Lana. That is a complete idea. It makes sense on its own. It is the main clause. Rewrite the sentence below, adding a subordinate clause. Remember to punctuate your answer correctly. Take 30 seconds to think. What needs to be at the start of your sentence? What needs to be at the end of your sentence? Do we need any additional punctuation if we are adding more information? The children played on the swings. How can we add a subordinate clause? The children played on the swings after they ate their lunch. After they ate their lunch is the subordinate clause. We have used a subordinating conjunction to add the ideas together, to link the ideas. We could also have, although it was getting dark, the children played on the swings. Again, although as an example of a subordinating conjunction, although it was getting dark is not a complete idea. It does not make sense on its own, therefore it is a subordinate clause. And both of my sentences start with a capital letter and end with a full stop. In the second example, you can see we have added more detail and we have needed to include a comma in that sentence. Points for you to remember when you tackle these questions. A clause always contains a subject performing a verb. A main clause makes sense on its own. A subordinate clause does not make sense on its own. It must be attached to a main clause. Conjunctions link clauses together. They can come in between the two clauses or at the beginning of the sentence.